The wind howled through the quiet streets of Middleton, a town where nothing much ever happened until that rainy November night. Officer Rachel Monroe sat in her cruiser, sipping lukewarm coffee and listening to dispatch updates that had long since blurred into background noise. Her canine partner, Diesel, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a scar over his right eye and a nose for trouble, rested quietly in the back seat. The streets were slick with rain, glistening under the orange glow of street lamps, and all signs pointed to another routine night. But then the call came in, a vague report of flickering lights and strange noises at the old St. Gabriel's Church on the outskirts of town. The church had been abandoned for over a decade, since the congregation dwindled and funding dried up. Teenagers would sometimes sneak in to tell ghost stories or dare each other to spend the night, but this call felt different. The caller had refused to leave a name and hung up before giving details, their voice trembling with what sounded like genuine fear. Rachel glanced in the rearview mirror at Diesel, who was already sitting up, ears perked and eyes alert. "You feel it too, boy," she murmured, setting down her cup and shifting into drive. The cruiser's tires splashed through puddles as they made their way out of town. St. Gabriel's loomed in the distance, its steeple crooked like a bent finger pointing to the heavens. The air grew colder as they approached, and Rachel shivered despite the heater blasting. Diesel began to whine softly, a sound Rachel had only heard once before, on a narcotics raid that had nearly gone sideways. He wasn't whining out of fear. He was sensing something. Something bad. They parked just outside the rusted iron gate, the headlights catching the edges of the old stone building. The stained glass windows were broken in places, boarded up hastily with rotting plywood. Ivy had overtaken the front entrance, wrapping the thick wooden doors like claws. Rachel opened the car door and stepped out, her boots crunching gravel. Diesel jumped out behind her, tail stiff, nose in the air. The silence was unnerving. No crickets, no wind, no distant traffic. Just the soft thudding of her heart and Diesel's quiet growl. She unclipped her flashlight and led Diesel through the gate, its hinges creaking like a cry for help. As they stepped onto the cracked pathway leading to the front door, Diesel stopped abruptly, hackles raised. He stared at the heavy doors, unmoving. Then, without warning, he lunged forward and began barking furiously, clawing at the door as if trying to get through. "What is it?" Rachel asked, voice low, pulling out her sidearm just in case. She placed a hand on Diesel's shoulder. His muscles were taut, his body trembling, not with fear, but urgency. Rachel leaned closer to the door and listened. At first, there was only silence. But then, a sound. Faint. Muffled. A whisper? A cry? She couldn't be sure. But it was human. That much she knew. She tried the handle. Locked. She circled around the side of the building, Diesel never leaving her side. They found a side door partially ajar, its frame swollen from water damage. Rachel pushed it open slowly, the door groaning in protest. She clicked her flashlight on and swept the beam through the dark hallway. Pews lay scattered like bones, some overturned, others splintered. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the air was thick with dust and rot. The moment they stepped inside, Diesel's demeanor changed again, less aggressive now, more focused. His nose twitched as he moved forward, following a trail Rachel couldn't see. They made their way through the nave, stepping over shattered glass and debris. Diesel stopped at the confessional booth, sniffing the wooden door. Rachel opened it cautiously. Empty. She turned toward the pulpit, where a large crucifix still hung, crooked and dusty. Behind it, the heavy velvet curtain swayed gently, though there was no breeze. Diesel growled again, low and guttural. Rachel raised her flashlight and slowly moved toward the curtain. As she reached out, her hand hesitated. Something about this felt wrong. Like they weren't alone. She pulled back the curtain. Behind it was a narrow door, newer than the rest of the church structure. It had a shiny silver handle and no keyhole, like it had been added much later. Diesel went rigid, tail straight, his body like a drawn bow. He placed a paw on the door and whined again. Rachel tried the handle. Locked. She stepped back, considering her options. Suddenly, Diesel barked and began pawing at the door, harder this time, frenzied. "Easy, boy," Rachel said, but she knew better than to ignore him. Something, or someone, was behind that door. She called it in. "Dispatch, this is Officer Monroe. I'm at St. Gabriel's. There's an unknown door behind the pulpit. My K9 is responding. Requesting backup. Static." Then nothing. She tried again. "Dispatch, can you read me?" More static. Rachel's stomach dropped. She looked at her phone, no signal. Typical out here. She had no choice but to proceed. Rachel stepped back and delivered a solid kick to the door, once, then again. On the third hit, the frame cracked and the door swung open into pitch blackness. Diesel bolted in before she could stop him. "Diesel," she called, raising her flashlight and hurrying inside. The air in the passage was damp and cold. It sloped downward into a basement level. Diesel's barks echoed off the walls, then abruptly stopped. Heart-pounding, Rachel descended the stairs. Her flashlight flickered but stayed on. The stairwell ended in a long corridor of stone, lit dimly by a single flickering bulb near the ceiling. At the far end of the hallway, she spotted Diesel standing still, ears back, staring at a second door. This one was metal. Industrial. Not part of any original church structure, that much was clear. It had bolts, latches, scratches, and something else, on the ground just before it, scraps of cloth. A shoe. And blood. Rachel stepped closer, crouching to examine the items. The shoe looked like it belonged to a child. Diesel whimpered and nudged the door with his snout. That's when she heard it, crying. Soft, barely audible, but unmistakably a child's cry from behind that metal door. "Hello?" Rachel called. "Police? I'm here to help. Can you hear me?" The crying stopped instantly. She looked around. No tools. No way to pry the door open by hand. She tried calling out again, but there was no response. Diesel circled the area, nose glued to the floor, sniffing every corner. Then he stopped at a section of the wall that looked different. Less dusty. Cleaner. Rachel tapped it. Hollow. A false wall? She pressed her shoulder into it and felt a slight give. Suddenly, there was a sharp metallic clang from behind the metal door, like something heavy being dragged. Rachel turned sharply, gun raised, flashlight trembling in her grasp. Diesel stood protectively in front of her, teeth bared. Something, or someone, was definitely back there. But what chilled her to the bone wasn't the noise. It was the writing, barely visible in the flickering light, scratched into the door's surface. "Do not open. Evil lives here." Rachel stared at the words, her breath catching in her throat. Diesel growled again, louder now. Then the crying resumed, only this time, it sounded wrong. Mechanical. Like a recording. She backed up slowly, every instinct in her body screaming to get out. But Diesel wouldn't move. He stood firm, guarding the door as if daring whatever was behind it to come through. Rachel whispered, "What the hell is this place?" And for once, Diesel didn't have an answer. Somewhere deep behind the steel, a second voice joined the child's. Lower. Inhuman. And laughing. Rachel's blood ran cold as the laughter echoed from behind the heavy metal door, followed once again by silence, deafening, suffocating silence. She felt like she had stepped out of time and place, like the normal rules of the world had been left behind the moment she entered that church. Her mind wanted to rationalize what she'd heard. Maybe it was an echo, a faulty speaker, even a deranged squatter trying to scare anyone off. But no matter how she tried to reason it out, nothing explained how her radio had died, how Diesel had acted, or how that whispering, mechanical cry had twisted into laughter that didn't sound human at all. Diesel continued to stand guard in front of the door, his ears flat, tail rigid. He hadn't made another sound, but his eyes were locked on the steel, unwavering. Rachel took a deep breath and forced her hand to stop shaking before she placed her palm on the door. It was ice cold. Not like the damp chill of a basement, but like something unnatural was behind it. Something that sucked the heat out of the room. The writing scratched into the door stared back at her, "Do not open. Evil lives here." The message looked old, like it had been there for years, the metal worn down beneath each carved letter. But this section of the church was clearly added more recently. Who wrote it? And why? She had to get back to her cruiser. She needed backup. Equipment. A way to cut through the metal. But as she turned toward the stairwell, Diesel barked sharply, a single, sharp warning. Rachel spun around. The door had moved. Just slightly. A groan of warped metal, like pressure was building from the other side. And then, a whisper. Barely audible. Rachel. Her own name. Not shouted. Not spoken. Whispered directly into her ear though no one was near her. She staggered back in shock, slamming into the stone wall behind her. She raised her flashlight, her weapon, blinking rapidly, heart racing. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice cracking. No answer. Only Diesel's low growl. She fled back up the stairs, Diesel close behind, his steps quick and silent. They burst through the main level of the church, the air somehow thicker than before. As she reached the side door, she yanked it open, gasping when she realized it was no longer raining. In fact, the ground was dry. The trees around the property were still, too still, like the entire church was frozen in its own dead time zone. Rachel sprinted to the cruiser, trying her radio again. "Dispatch! This is Officer Monroe. I need immediate assistance at St. Gabriel's Church. Possible abduction. Possible hostile subject. Do you copy?" A burst of static. Then, Fentley, Monroe, report location, repeat. St. Gabriel's. Send backup now. I'm not alone in the building. Static again. Diesel barked at the forest line. Rachel turned and saw something, or someone, standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the headlights. A figure, tall and unmoving. Dressed in black, face obscured. She shouted, "Police! Don't move!" But before she could react, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees without a sound. "Stay," she told Diesel firmly, locking him in the cruiser this time. He barked furiously, but Rachel couldn't risk losing him to whatever was going on. She grabbed her backup flashlight, her taser, and returned to the church. It felt like walking back into a nightmare. Her boots hit the dusty tiles of the chapel floor once more. She crossed back behind the pulpit, the velvet curtain now completely still. When she descended the basement stairs again, the air was colder. The bulb above flickered violently now, barely illuminating the hallway. She reached the metal door. The child's shoe and cloth scraps were still there. The blood had not dried. But now something new was waiting, something that hadn't been there before. A symbol. Drawn in chalk, directly on the door. A circle with crooked triangles pointing inward. It looked ritualistic, ancient, and deeply wrong. Rachel crouched slowly, examined it without touching. Was someone trying to keep something in, or summon something out? She pressed her ear to the door again. Silence. No crying. No laughter. But her own name still echoed in her mind. Someone knew she was here. Someone, or something. She took out her phone to take a picture of the symbol. But when she opened the camera, it glitched, showing static before the screen turned black. The flashlight on the phone sputtered and died. Then a sudden clink behind her. Rachel spun around, gun drawn. The confessional door, upstairs. It was swinging open and shut. But no wind blew. She took a step back, gripping her weapon tighter. "If you're in here, come out now." "I'm not playing games," she said. Footsteps. Upstairs. Slow. Deliberate. Rachel backed out of the basement hallway and up into the church again. The pews cast long shadows now, despite no change in the lighting. The confessional stood still again. But there were footprints, bare, small, like a child's, wet and glistening, leading from the center aisle to the altar. Then they vanished. No more prints. No dirt. Just a void where they ended. She scanned the room. Is there a child in here? Are you hurt? I'm here to help, she called out, trying to sound calm. But every muscle in her body screamed at her to run. Then, something moved on the altar. Rachel stepped closer. It was a doll. An old one, porcelain face cracked, missing one eye, and dressed in a little church dress. It hadn't been there before. She was sure of it. The air grew thick around her, and her breath fogged out in front of her. She reached forward to examine it, then the organ in the back of the chapel played a single, thunderous note on its own. She dropped the flashlight. It hit the ground with a clang and rolled under the nearest pew. The music grew louder. Another note. Then another. The organ was playing. Rachel aimed her weapon at it, but the bench in front of the keys was empty. That's when she heard the voice again. Rachel. Only now, it was behind her. She whirled around. No one. But the doll was gone. She backed away, flashlight still on the ground. She crouched to grab it, and as she looked beneath the pew, her blood froze. A face. Pale, unmoving, with empty black holes for eyes, stared back at her from the darkness under the church floorboards. It didn't blink. It didn't breathe. But it watched. Rachel screamed, scrambling back and kicking her flashlight away in the process. When she looked again, the face was gone. No trace. No sign anyone had been there. She ran back to the cruiser, heart thundering, lungs burning, her voice raw as she shouted into the radio. This time it worked. This is Officer Monroe. I need backup now. There is something inside the church. Something not human. Dispatch responded instantly. Units en route, Officer Monroe. ETA 10 minutes. She collapsed into the seat, Diesel whining as she slammed the door and locked it. It's okay, boy, she whispered, clutching his fur. We're okay. But Diesel didn't seem convinced. He stared at the church, low growl in his throat. Because the front doors, those massive, boarded, sealed doors, were open now. Wide open. No one stood there. But something was waiting. And Diesel knew they had just scratched the surface of whatever horror lived beneath St. Gabriel's. The front doors of St. Gabriel's Church stood wide open, silent and unmoving like the gates to a forgotten tomb. Rachel sat frozen in the cruiser, staring at them, her breath shallow, hands white-knuckled around the steering wheel. Diesel growled beside her, low and steady, his fur raised along his spine. It was as if the church itself had awakened, and it had invited them back in. But this time, she wasn't going alone. She checked her firearm, loaded a spare clip, and clipped Diesel's harness to her belt. We go in together, partner, she said, voice barely above a whisper. The backup officers were minutes away, but she couldn't wait. A child had been inside that place. Or something that sounded like a child. Either way, it wasn't going to stop. She could feel it now, something had been disturbed, as if their presence had triggered a chain reaction, and now it was unraveling. They approached the doors cautiously, Diesel leading with his nose low and his body rigid. As they crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped instantly. The pews were as they had left them, scattered and broken. The doll was still gone. The organ silent. But now, there was something new. Footsteps. Not just one set, many. Tiny bare feet padding across wood. They came from above. Rachel's eyes traced the balcony where the choir once stood. There, in the flickering shadows, figures began to appear. Children. At least a dozen. Pale. Silent. Still. All staring directly at her. Not moving. Not blinking. Just watching. Diesel barked sharply and pressed closer to Rachel's leg. One of the children, a little girl in a tattered Sunday dress, pointed toward the altar. Rachel's heart pounded. She stepped forward, slowly, and saw that the pulpit was now covered in old paper, pages torn from books, scribbled with frantic handwriting and symbols. She picked up one. It was a church registry. Names crossed out violently, marked with red ink. At the bottom, scribbled in shaky letters, they wanted to trap it, not release it. But the prayers turned into invitations. They sang it into our world. Rachel's skin crawled. She moved toward the basement again. Diesel hesitated, then followed. The stairs felt longer this time, the shadows deeper. The hallway at the bottom buzzed faintly, like electricity in the walls. And the steel door was open. Just a crack. The symbol chalked on its surface was smeared, like someone had tried to wipe it away. Rachel reached out and pushed it slowly. Beyond the door, a chamber waited, one that didn't match any blueprint of the church. The stone was older, carved by hand. Symbols lined the walls, pulsing with an unnatural glow. In the center was a pit, circular, dark, and deep. Chains hung from the ceiling above it, and next to the pit stood an altar. And on the altar, a child. Rachel gasped. She was real. Breathing. Gagged and tied, tears streaking down her dirty cheeks. Her clothes were shredded, and she looked barely 10 years old. Diesel growled, baring his teeth. Rachel ran to her, cutting the restraints and whispering, "It's okay, I've got you." The girl clung to her, sobbing. That's when Rachel heard it, the slow creak of chains above. She turned toward the pit. Something was rising. It wasn't fast. But it didn't need to be. The air shifted, became heavier. Diesel barked, lunged toward the pit and barked again, this time in sheer panic. Rachel grabbed the girl and stepped back. "We're leaving," she said out loud, even as the whispers began again. Not one voice this time, but dozens. Screaming. Laughing. Begging. The pit belched out a gust of freezing wind. A hand, long, pale, with fingers like bones, grasped the edge of the stone. Then another. Rachel didn't wait to see more. She turned and ran, carrying the girl in her arms, Diesel bounding ahead. The moment they stepped back into the hallway, the steel door slammed shut behind them with a boom that shook the walls. The ground beneath them trembled. She didn't stop. She sprinted up the stairs, through the main floor, past the pews and the altar. The children on the balcony were gone. The air was screaming now, not with sound, but with pressure, like the atmosphere was about to implode. Rachel burst through the front doors into the night just as the backup cruisers arrived. Lights flashed, sirens wailed. She waved frantically, collapsing onto the grass with the girl in her arms. Officers ran toward her, guns drawn, faces etched with confusion and fear. Sergeant Mike Sanderson knelt beside her. "Rachel, what the hell is going on?" "There's something in there," she gasped. "In the basement." "A pit." "There was a child tied to an altar." I think someone was trying to summon something." Mike paled. "This church has been sealed for years. There are no records of anyone going in or out. And the foundation, Rachel, there's no basement. This church was built directly on rock." Rachel's eyes widened. "That's not possible." Officers swept the building, but when they returned, their faces said everything. "There's no steel door," one said. "No chamber. Just old pews and dust. It's like whatever you saw, it's not there anymore." Rachel turned to the girl. "What's your name?" The child blinked slowly, eyes wide with fear. "Lily." "Lily, do you know how you got here?" She shook her head. "I heard singing. I followed the sound. The doors opened. But when I went inside, it got dark. And something whispered to me. It said it wanted to wear my skin. Rachel held her tighter. Diesel sat beside them, his eyes still fixed on the church door. Later, after paramedics took Lily to the hospital and Rachel gave her full report, she sat alone in the cruiser. Diesel rested his head on her lap, but his ears twitched every few seconds. She looked one last time at the church. The doors were closed again. Completely shut. But carved into the wood now, fresh, still bleeding, were 5 words that hadn't been there before. Thank you for opening it. Rachel didn't sleep that night. Neither did Diesel. And for weeks after, she avoided churches, hymns, and the sound of whispering wind. Because she knew what they'd found wasn't gone. It was waiting. Beneath Middleton. Beneath the world we think is safe. Waiting to be invited in again.